Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Hollow Parties, the Many Pasts and Disordered Present of American Party Politics, by Daniel Schlozman and Sam Rosenfeld. Narrated by Tom Beyer. Publisher's note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to figures and tables present in the print and e-book formats of the book. 1. The Problem of Hollow Parties. May 19, 1981. Richard Richards, chair of the Republican National Committee, RNC, sat alone at a table. It was a testy breakfast at the Capitol Hill Club. A who's who from the emergent New Right, whose myriad groups stood apart from the formal party, all avoided Richards. Terry Dolan of the National Conservative Political Action Committee, Paul Weyrich of the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress, direct mail impresario Richard Viguerie, Phyllis Schlafly of Eagle Forum and Stop ERA, Reed Larson of the National Right to Work Committee, Ed McAteer of Religious Roundtable, Tom Ellis of Jesse Helms's Congressional Club, and billionaire oil man and John Birch Society member Bunker Hunt. Richards, a conservative but tradition-minded political operative from Utah, had complained about the independent groups making mischief where the party did not want them. Their lavish advertising campaigns and repeated interventions in primaries usurped the traditional roles of the political party. The new rightists were, he told them, like loose cannonballs on the deck of a ship. Nonsense, responded John Lofton, editor of the Viguerie-owned Conservative Digest. If he attacked those fighting hardest for Ronald Reagan and his tax cuts, it was Richards himself who was the loose cannonball. The contretemps soon blew over, and no future formal party leader would follow Richards's example and again take independent groups to task. But it was a sign of the transformation sweeping American party politics as the right's loose cannonballs eventually came to dominate and define the grand old party. February 3, 2020. With all eyes on Iowa, the state Democratic Party offered up a kaleidoscope of party dysfunction. Following rules set down by the Democratic National Committee, DNC, the state's presidential nominating caucuses that year were set to be the most transparent on record. Iowans would gather in school gyms and cafeterias to debate their choices for a nominee, ascertain which candidates had met viability thresholds to elect county convention delegates, and reallocate supporters of candidates below the threshold. Precinct chairs would then use a smartphone app to submit 3 vote tallies, the number of supporters for each candidate both before and after reallocation, and, by a formula, the number of state delegate equivalents. That, at least, was the plan. Then came reality. The cumbersome app, developed by a secretive startup poetically named Shadow Incorporated, had not been properly debugged after last-minute modifications ordered by the DNC, and it soon broke down. Chairs who wanted to call the Iowa Democratic Party hotline to report results, as they had in caucuses past, failed to get through. Faced with catastrophe, the state party vanished, reporting no results until late the following afternoon, long after the candidates had departed for New Hampshire. Unable to implement the DNC's rules, the Iowa Democratic Party had failed to perform the basic task of election management. Enervation in the state party, of a piece with atrophied state and local party organizations throughout the country, had taken its toll. Meanwhile, para-organizations like Shadow that had emerged in the void left by formal parties faced distinct incentives and little accountability for grifting and incompetence. And in the days that followed the caucuses, the incompetence ironically fueled conspiracy theories that reached far beyond Iowa. The DNC, the theories alleged, was actually working all too competently to manipulate the process and deny the people's voice. Underneath all the recriminations was the caucus process itself, an artifact of the Democrats' 1970s-era party reforms. Their aim had been to take control from the bosses and give parties a new civic vitality. Inside the school gyms came signs of that civic vitality, but the breakdown that followed said something different. The Richards breakfast and the Iowa debacle, 4 decades apart, tell two sides of the same story. Contemporary American parties are hollow parties. Hard shells, marked with the scars of inter-party electoral conflict, cover disordered cores, devoid of concerted action and positive loyalties. Organizationally top-heavy and poorly rooted, the parties are dominated by satellite groups and command little respect in the eyes of voters and activists alike. Nobody, whether in the formal parties themselves or in the proliferating groups that swirl around them, has effectively brought political elites and the mass public together in positive common purpose. Hollowness matters because parties matter. When vigorous and civically rooted parties link the governed with their government while schooling citizens in the unending give and take of political engagement, they give legitimacy to democratic rule. They bring blocks of voters together under a common banner, negotiating priorities among competing interests to construct agendas that resonate in the electorate. They render politics into ordered conflict, playing by the electoral rules of the game and gatekeeping against forces that might undermine such shared commitments. In each of these roles, competing parties at their best serve as stewards of democratic alternatives. When they falter, so does the political system. Party hollowness has developed alongside polarization in linked but distinct processes. Para-party groups like those that gave Dick Richards headaches in 1981 proved key instigators in both developments, as ideological warriors seeking simultaneously to tear down the power and prerogatives of the Republican Party and to make mercenary use of that very party. The two major parties now manifest hollowness asymmetrically, reflecting different pathologies in their approach to power. Put bluntly, Democratic ineffectuality on one hand and Republican extremism on the other. If ours are hollow parties, what might unhollow parties look like? This book looks to the past for our yardstick. The long history of American party politics reveals no golden age, but rather disparate fragments of a more vital, organized politics to take to heart. Through the 19th century, parties rooted themselves deeply in everyday civic life. One of those parties stands out. Republicans in the party's first decades, from the 1850s through Reconstruction, pushed forward a party vision at its loftiest as they fought to save the Union and redeem the promise of American freedom. A century later, issue-oriented democratic reformers mobilized partisan action for New Deal liberalism and civil rights. In those same years, cadres of practical-minded Republicans embodied a conservatism resistant to extremes and grounded in nuts-and-bolts organization. The past, in short, provides no model party to recover, but offers suggestive models aplenty of American parties that succeeded where hollow parties fall short. The coming chapters trace the path, stretching back to the founding in the 18th century and running all the way forward, that has brought American political parties to their present state. But before our historical narrative begins in earnest, this chapter frames the problem of hollow parties and our approach to explaining it. We first define party hollowness and sketch its emergence since the 1970s. We then outline our wide-angle view of party. Finally, we end the chapter with a discussion of our perspective as scholars and as citizens in a troubled democracy. Party hollowness. Worry pervades the American political scene. The watchwords blaring from covers in bookstores and newsstands all tend toward doom, dysfunction, division, even crisis and democratic backsliding. Yet political parties' specific contributions to our present discontents remain a subject of strikingly little consensus or clarity. Commentators peg parties alternatively as culprits in or casualties of toxic political conflict. But whether as villains or victims, parties are nowhere accounted for as collective actors whose trajectories require explanation in their own right. Instead, they occupy a paradoxical status in descriptions of the polarized country's predicament, seemingly everywhere and nowhere, overbearing and enfeebled, all at once. This book untangles that paradox. Party teams in both government and the mass public now define the politics of a polarized era, whose signal feature is dislike of political opponents that often rises to anger. And as measured in sheer activity, from electioneering to advocacy to outreach, the actors in and around the parties do plenty, and, at least within circumscribed realms, have significant impact in doing it. But for all that activity, political parties neither set the terms for nor control the passions of our unruly politics. Hollowness, we argue, is the condition that makes sense of these contradictory tendencies. Hollow parties are parties that, for all their array of activities, demonstrate fundamental incapacities in organizing democracy. This distinctive combination of activity and incapacity manifests itself across multiple dimensions. As a civic presence in an era of nationalized politics, hollow parties are unrooted in communities and unfelt in ordinary people's day-to-day lives. Organizationally, they tilt toward national entities at the expense of state and local ones. Swarming networks of unattached para-party groups without popular accountability overshadow formal party organizations at all levels. Finally, hollow parties lack legitimacy. The mass public and engaged political actors alike share neither positive loyalty to their allied party nor deference to the preferences of its leaders. Today's parties are distinctive for the presence of so many figures entwined with and buzzing around, but not organizationally part of formal party organizations themselves. We give this disorderly assortment surrounding each party a collective term that captures its amorphous and undirected quality: the party blob. Fueled by the dual explosions of second Gilded Age wealth and small-dollar online fundraising, the two party blobs now overshadow the formal parties. For many of these para-party organizations, neither electoral success nor policy achievements serve as the front-and-center goal or metric of success and accountability. That leaves the core tasks of a political party to corral allies and build electoral coalitions sufficient to take control of government and implement an agenda, paradoxically underserved. Without side groups dominating political life, the formal parties serve as punching bags for ideological activists and candidate operations more than as conscious stewards of a political enterprise. The party blobs contain multitudes. Single and multi-issue ideological groups, many of them with paper members or no members at all. Media figures, from talk show hosts to online personalities, guided by profit and celebrity at least as much as by substantive or electoral goals. Think tank policy wonks generating party programs by proxy. Traditional political action committees, PACs, run by interest groups and politicians trading favors with their colleagues. Nominally uncoordinated super PACs and dark money 501c', billionaire mega-donors with varied and often idiosyncratic agendas, and an ever-changing array of consultancies peddling technical services in electioneering, digital politics, and political finance in hopes of grabbing a share of all the money sloshing through the system. The defining feature of the party blob is precisely this amorphousness, a jumble of principles and incentives that contradict scholarly depictions of party networks seamlessly coordinating in the pursuit of shared goals. With the party's incapacity to power purposive action, and the party blob's ascendance, have come diminished expectations. Raise the bar for parties, and contemporary limits come into sharper relief. Back in 1987, the political scientist K. Lawson took prescient note of what had already been lost. The weaknesses of the parties in articulating and aggregating interests, recruiting and nominating their own candidates, and devising programs for which such candidates can in fact be held accountable, are regarded as no longer worth mentioning. Such functions are no longer what parties are all about. Parties now find themselves hobbled in pursuit of all of the tasks on Lawson's list. As real political actors with particular claims and commitments, as opposed to mere abstract markers of identity, parties neither engender trust and loyalty from nor provide a source of meaning and belonging to most Americans. And the problem feeds on itself. The activity and incapacity that together characterize hollow parties render them particularly unsuited for conscious public conversation about parties and their place in public life. How hollowness happened. We date the emergence of a hollow party era to the demise of what scholars call the New Deal order by the late 1970s. The historical accounts in ensuing chapters emphasize just how much was up for grabs and how different party politics might have been had the struggle come out differently during the critical juncture of the 1970s. Alternative political worlds for the parties, still possible at the eve of this pivotal decade, became occluded in its wake. Two core processes worked in tandem to reshape American politics beginning in the 1970s. Neoliberalism, to use an elusive but necessary organizing concept, and party polarization. The post-war political economy had tied together steady growth, fixed exchange rates, active economic management focused on stimulating demand, and strong unions. Thanks to blows struck from both within and without, the arrangements that powered the New Deal order began to unravel rapidly in the late 1970s. With time, as the neoliberal turn worked profound changes at all levels of party politics, the re-entry of the South into two-party competition finally began to sort Democrats and Republicans into polarized teams. Even as this sorting drove a resurgence of partisan organizing and activism, however, the brittle and unrooted parties found they could not contain the conflictual politics that ensued. New approaches to influencing policy and financing elections boxed in the parties, just when they most needed to assert stewardship over their own destinies. The post-1970 advocacy explosion in Washington swelled the ranks of interest groups, think tanks, and lobbying shops. A new system of campaign finance arose, suffused with cash, but distinctly unhelpful for parties' efforts to shape and pursue agendas in power. The combination of the 1974 amendments to the Federal Election Campaign Act and the Supreme Court's decision 2 years later in Buckley v. Vallejo constrained party fundraising while doing nothing to stem the rising costs of campaigns. A rising class of professional operatives plied their trade, typically inside the network of a single party, for some mix of candidates, party committees, PACs, and as time went on, independent expenditure groups. Initially, the formal parties' responses to this new environment seemed to revitalize them. The national party committees, with Republicans in the lead, ramped up funding, expanded staff, and reinvested national dollars into campaign support. With a label that suggests its very limits, scholars termed the model that emerged from these developments the service party. Parties would work primarily to provide campaign resources to and broker interest group support for the candidate operations that now dominated electoral politics. Even within these strictures, however, the formal party's relative clout waned as outside groups, funded by both mega-donors and armies of small-dollar givers, eventually overwhelmed traditional channels of political finance. In the wake of the 2010 Supreme Court decision in Citizens United v. Federal Election Commission, a tangled and often hard-to-trace multiplicity of pass-throughs, super PACs, and dark money outfits have all showered money on campaigns and consultants. Candidate campaigns and outside groups together spent 3 times as much as national party organizations in 2020. The money glut has only deepened the problems of party management that so characterize the era of hollowness. These changes have manifested in starkly different ways across the two parties. The Democrats' battered labor-liberal alliance, long the great champion of program and discipline in party politics, found itself adrift in the 1970s, while party actors began to regroup along different lines. Starting in the 1980s, they built up the national party's financial might and embraced para-party lobbies and hangers-on, but struggled to define an underlying party purpose. Some heralded a post-industrial future, while others unapologetically filled the party's coffers in the name of organizational revival. The coalitional and financial consequences continued to hold sway even as the party lurched haltingly leftward in the new century. On the other side, the political tendency that we term the long new right decisively captured the Republican Party during the same years in the 1970s. The right-wing brokers of the long new right treated parties as no more than instruments in a struggle for power. Their triumph broke through the fetters that had long restrained political action. Unshackled, the Republican Party became a vehicle to fight its political enemies on any institutional ground it could find. At the GOP's core was a plutocratic populist bargain. An electoral politics of resentment would serve as handmaiden to a regressive policy agenda. Politics as culture war, in turn, fueled the growth of a media advocacy complex that has at various times acted as principal rather than agent, and has at all times undermined party actors' ability to police boundaries against extremism. The Republican Party that emerged in its wake, desirous of power however it can be gotten, has retreated from the commitments that make parties central pillars of small d Democratic and small r Republican politics. In short, since the 70s, a hollowed-out Democratic Party has been rendered listless by conflicting actors, and a hollowed-out Republican Party pulled to radicalism by committed actors. By rooting party hollowness's genesis in the political economic developments of the 1970s and emphasizing the decisive role of the right in bringing it about, we treat as secondary what other scholars often depict as pivotal, namely, the end of traditional party organizations and the demise of old intra-party arrangements beginning a decade earlier in the 1960s. Following the disastrous 1968 convention, the Democrats' Commission on Party Structure and Delegate Selection, commonly known as the McGovern-Fraser Commission, unintentionally prompted the spread of state primaries to select presidential convention delegates. As political scientists have long noted, this shift undermined state and local party organizations that in the pre-reform system had benefited from control over their delegates. It also left Democrats and Republicans rhetorically and politically ill-equipped to justify any special prerogatives for party actors in internal decision-making. Critically, however, the McGovern-Fraser reformers' unrealized vision of open, activist-driven parties still operated within a venerable paradigm, ultimately tracing back to the rise of mass parties, which treated party forms as important and party contestation as a special category of conflict in the political system. This is precisely the paradigm from which the long New Right made such a decisive break. Imagine a past that featured McGovern-Fraser, but not the long New Right. Such a scenario would have led to vastly different outcomes in later 20th century politics and beyond, not merely different rules for nomination. The counterfactual exercise helps to clarify the central point. In our actual past, hollow parties emerged from the world that the long New Right made. As our diagnosis looks rightward, its attention to the Republican Party gives our work particular urgency. The Trump era brought a torrent of scholarship on democratic crisis in America. One line of analysis emphasizes how polarized parties and fragmented Madisonian institutions together produce dysfunction and escalatory hardball. Another looks to political behavior in the electorate and the toxic force of effective partisanship. Still another has turned to America's troubled past for precedents and origin stories. These inquiries inform ours, but none of them directly explain the party's present incapacities. Indeed, even as many of the scholarly doomsayers have pointed the finger at the Republican Party, they have said less about exactly how the party took its present course. By rooting present-day Democratic discontents inside the history of American party politics, this book aims to meet that challenge. Hollow parties do not merely enfeeble governance, they endanger democracy. Developments roiling American democracy resonate deeply with patterns abroad. Parties are failing, wrote the late Peter Mayer, his eyes on Western Europe, because the zone of engagement, the traditional world of party democracy where citizens interacted with and felt a sense of attachment to their political leaders, is being evacuated. In the distinct American institutional environment with a pure party duopoly, however, they take on a different cast.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?